So our next speaker is Chris Goodall, eminent green author. Do you, Chris, think this adaptation resilience agenda, is it a sort of distraction, do you think? Should we be just saying, no, we're not going to let climate change get out of hand, we're going to do all we can to cut emissions? Or should we be saying, well, actually, we can't quite do it all. Climate's going to change anyway, we'd better get adapting. Give us your view.
You want to fight, don't you? You want people to say things.
Give us your view on where the balance of those things lies.
I'll give the opposite view, which is that attempts to control emissions at the local level that Sarah's just been talking about, whether it be in Totnes or Newcastle and New South Wales, have historically had a very small impact on the carbon dioxide generated by those communities. I don't wish to seem too cynical, but there are clearly enormous benefits to transition towns. They really do work. They don't, so far, appear to me to have cut emissions very much. That's not to say they shouldn't happen. And if we're going to try to cut emissions, we probably have to do so on a completely different model, and one which may incorporate things like transition towns, but won't have community-based ventures as the main instrument for achieving that, because I think the evidence is that it's not able to institute the kind of changes that are large enough and effective enough and quick enough to make the difference we need.
Carry on.
About 8 years ago, I published a book on how one, as an individual, might do something about one's personal climate changing emissions, carbon dioxide principally. Reasonably large number of copies of that book were sold, although I have to say I think it's virtually unreadable, because it hit something.
Sorry, Chris, can I ask, do you need the lectern? Because I think you're picking up off the lectern mic, so can we have the...
Can we turn the lectern mic
turn
off?
the lectern mic off, please? I don't think we need it on.
Or I can stand here? Is that...
Yeah, they're both good, yeah.
Is that all right?
Yep.
In that book, I went through the ways in which your responsibility as an individual for carbon emissions was made up. How much of it was heating your house, driving your car, taking an aeroplane. The conclusion of that is that for people with a middle-class lifestyle in the southeast of England, by far the dominant cause of climate-changing emissions from the personal lifestyle was air travel, with, in some cases, that being more than 50% of the total emissions of an individual. The next is meat, and the next is heating the house. And after I wrote that book, I went to give talks to anybody who would listen to me in drafty church halls around England, often very small audiences, it has to be said, but it was always fun. But I'd give my talk about what one might do as an individual to act morally in the face of this greatest moral challenge the world has ever faced. And I'm afraid, I got to the point where I said, well, if you really want to do something about your responsibility for emissions, you need to stop traveling by air. And the faces in the audience fell. And these were Quakers, and these were people in the Methodist Church Hall, and so on and so forth. And after I'd done that for 6 months, I came to the conclusion that this wasn't going to be a way to change things. It wasn't even effective in creating a bunch of exemplars, people who go out into their communities and get people to do things differently, because it runs so much counter to the culture of our age. And I decided then it was about time to start working on where you might be able to get a significant enough change to make a difference to the progress towards the now almost inevitable 2 degrees of warming. And I'm afraid I'm an author, so I always want to talk about the book that I'm writing. I apologize for that. I'm writing a book intending to be optimistic, because I think the reasons for optimism, the causes for optimism, are now more visible, more appropriate, more real than they've ever been in the past. And that's because one country, Germany, about 15 years ago, decided it was going to start heavily subsidizing the installation of solar photovoltaic technologies. Over the course of that last 15 years, the price of solar PV has continued to drop every year, pretty much at the same rate, and it will continue. And by now, we're seeing in many parts of the world that solar PV is delivering electricity at prices below fossil fuels. And that's the core of my argument. If we're going to do something about climate change, about the growth of emissions, we cannot do so by stopping people who don't have enough energy getting access to that energy. We have to give them that energy at the cheapest possible price, cheaper than coal, cheaper than oil, cheaper than gas. And because of the selfless attitude of the Germans 15 years ago, and the world will come to thank Germany enormously, it's now possible to envisage almost everywhere in the world, probably bar the UK, getting more of its power from solar photovoltaics than any other technology. We see in China, we see in India, we see all around the world that PV is becoming the choice for all forms, all new investment in electricity generating technology. But you say, the sun doesn't shine all around. It doesn't shine all the time, and it shines intermittently when it does. So we have a second problem, and you'll have to read the full book in order to understand this. How to manage the intermittency, the unreliability of solar energy. We now, I have to say, have the technologies to do that. It's a mixture of storage and things even more advanced than that, such as artificial photosynthesis. But it's all there. And the extraordinary thing is a reasonably large fraction of the research that's driving these complements to solar PV is occurring around the UK in little companies that are making real differences to the future of the planet. They are all, without exception, finding it almost impossible to raise finance. We need to change that. But the reasons for optimism, the thing that's driving me through this book and making it such an enjoyable experience, he said suspiciously, is the fact that it is clearly now within our grasp to do something about climate change without affecting the chance of people in the third world, developing countries, having a decent standard of living based around the availability of a reasonable quantity of energy.
Chris, thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted you mentioned the Germans. They mandated 1 million solar roofs. And the year after that, I was in California talking to entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and they said that the Germans' decision to mandate 1,000 roofs created a big enough market for them to throw money at this, which then in turn created a market for the Chinese to come in and underbid each other to bring the cost down. So can I invite this eminent society to give a round of applause to the Germans? Let us hope it resounds to Berlin. Thank you, Germans. I want to raise a couple of issues with you, Chris. I mean, it is lovely to have some optimism. I'm feeling less pessimistic than I ever have in 25 years reporting on this stuff, largely because of the technological changes. But solar power at the moment is less than 1% of global total power.
Yes.
And we simply can't scale it up just quickly enough.
Well, the question I would ask you, Roger, is why can't we scale it up quickly enough? It's actually a relatively simple problem to solve. For the last 50 years, solar power has grown on average at 40% a year. And it's grown pretty reliably between 30 and 50% a year. That is to say, each year there was 25, 30, 40, 50% more solar PV installed than ever before. There is no constraint on the amount of solar that we can put in. It's now responsible, as Roger said, for less than 1% of world energy demand, although it might crash through 1% sometime next year. But if we continue on that 40% trajectory, by 2035, we'll cover the entire energy needs of the world from solar PV. And you're probably saying to yourself, things never work out like that. How can he be so insane as to think this could happen? But I want you to ask yourself, why not? If solar PV is the cheapest technology in the world, and a big contract, for example, was let to a large international corporation to build PV in India this week at a price of less than 7 cents, US dollar cents per kilowatt hour. That is cheaper than you can get electricity from coal or from gas in India. That's occurring around the world all the time, and all it requires is some more factories to put out solar panels. We're also seeing historically unprecedented rates of improvement in non-conventional solar panel technology. You think of solar panels, we all think of solar panels as big bits of silicon encased in glass. It ain't going to look like that in 10 years' time. it's going to be plastic adhered to the side of buildings. There'll be no environmental issues, nobody will be complaining about the fact that land is being taken over for this. Through things like that, we are going to be able to access energy at lower prices than we've ever been able to do so before. So I'm not an optimistic person by nature, but every time I look at the technology in this entire field, I say, my goodness, the progress is so fast that we could really envisage switching all new generation away from fossil fuels within a few years.
Because I am an optimist by nature, but when I hear your prognosis, I just sense rose-tinted spectacles. You're talking about electricity demand being met by solar. I think the International Energy Agency projects 50% solar by 2050. Then there's all of heating. Then there's all of heating for industry. Then there's all of transport
yes.
need. I mean, this is massive, and we haven't even started to look at how to tackle those issues.
So, if I may use an example from the UK, I chaired a conference today on the creation of an energy-independent Cornwall. What can this county, which has very high energy prices, the greatest amount of fuel poverty in England, what can it do to make itself independent using only non-fossil fuel? And we looked in detail at how the energy demand of Cornwall is made up, how much of it's electricity, how much of it's oil for heating, how much of it's gas, how much it's cars. And we said how much of that could be switched to electricity. A very large amount of that can be switched to electricity, whether it's electric cars or whether it's electricity for heating through heat pumps. There are enormous problems in the transition of non-conventional electricity using out from fossil to PV. But there's absolutely no reason why the vast majority of energy uses cannot be moved to energy carriers that were created by the sun, whether it's electricity created by solar power, whether it's heat created by solar thermal panels on the roof, whether it's the next 2 generations on, and we're already seeing this being commercialized in the United States, if effectively artificial photosynthesis, photons of light hitting things in water, which then produces usually microbes, which then produces a byproduct, ethanol, which is effectively a substitute for petrol. There are no limits to how we can use the energy from the sun to generate reasonable living standards for everybody in the world. The sun is pouring, I'll just give you a sense of the scale. The world at the moment is using about 17 terawatts. Don't worry about what a terawatt is. That's how much the world is using today. The sun is giving us today 90,000 terawatts. Only a small fraction of that's converted into wind or anything like that. We are going to end up, as a world, using the power of the sun as the main way in which we generate the energy in the forms that we want. Now, Roger's quite rightly accused me of having rose-tinted spectacles. That, however, that statement that solar will become the dominant energy source of the world is a statement made by the CEO of Shell 4 weeks ago. He said it was the dominant energy backbone of the world will be solar photovoltaics. Not many people know. I don't know. Did you see that, Roger? I mean, it's a truly remarkable statement.
I reported it before then.
Yeah, but sorry. Okay. It was one-upmanship.
He probably picked it up.
So it's not just the nutters like me who work on green energy who think that in the end everything's going to be solar. Even people whose livelihoods depend upon the maintenance of a fossil fuel economy know that it's just a question of time. Our task as a society is to make it happen fastest and with as least disruption as possible to the people who are least able to afford the transition.
Splendid. Thank you, Chris.